I was roughed up, slapped, made to kneel down by a sentry, kicked in the chest, sent sprawling because I did not know that I had to bow to him to cross the bridge. I felt that the dark ages had descended upon us. So suddenly, in August 1965, we had to create a nation out of a motley collection of Chinese, Indians, Malays, and others who had come to Singapore to seek a better life, but not to be a nation. If you're going to get a people to take national service seriously, I could not ask other people's sons to fight and die for the properties of the wealthy. Policies must be pragmatic, not dogmatic. I learned early to ignore political correctness and to reject conventional wisdom when it did not accord with reality or my experience. Now, I believe it will be equally mistaken to follow mindlessly the current politically correct and stridently advocated view that democracy is the precondition for economic development. I know it's a heresy in Harvard, Cambridge. What a country needs for growth and progress is stability and good government, one that is honest and effective and works for the benefit of the people. Good government should never be shackled by theories, however attractive and logically elegant. Satellite television has allowed me to follow the American presidential campaign. I'm amazed at the way media professionals can give a candidate a new image and transform him, at least superficially, into a different personality. Winning an election becomes, in large measure, a contest in packaging and advertising. These new techniques have been so successful that Europe has also bought into them. A spin doctor now is a high-income professional, one in great demand. From such a process, I doubt if a Churchill, a Roosevelt, or a de Gaulle can emerge.
我们刚刚看到的是25年前新加坡开国总理李光耀在哈佛大学的一场演讲片段。在那场演讲中，他对自己几十年来的治国经验，以及对什么是好领导、什么是好政府，做出了一系列堪称教科书级的论述。25年过去了，世界发生了翻天覆地的变化。当我们今天再回看这段演讲，再对比今天西方世界，特别是美英等国一代不如一代，甚至日益小丑化的领导人时，会有一种怎样穿越时空的讽刺感。在接下来的内容中，我们将重温这场经典的演讲。你将听到这位实用主义大师是如何阐述他关于国家治理、领导力选拔和长期规划的核心思想的。这不仅是一次历史回顾，更像是一次跨越25年的打脸现场。让我们继续。
My work was on a small frame of an island some 224 square miles at low tide. Not to be compared with the white canvas of other world leaders. First question I ask in writing this speech, are there lessons on leadership? It's easier to recognize a man who is already a leader than to identify one before he becomes a leader. During my 40 years in office, I've met many foreign leaders in government, in the military, and in business. The characteristics they have in common were self-confidence, breadth of mind, the ability to see the woods for the trees, and the ability to communicate. I'm familiar with most of the first generation of anti-colonial leaders to which I belong. They all had strong nationalist, anti-colonial convictions and wanted to prove that their people or their peoples could measure up to their former rulers. Unhappily, many third world leaders who had successfully demolished the old order failed to build a new one. Because building a new order demanded different and more complex capabilities. Decision-making in economics to achieve the highest returns on capital was not their forte. They could enthuse their followers to keep up the fight against the old regime. And they had oversimplified what needed to be done after the colonizers had handed over power. Many leaders actually believed their own rhetoric, that once they were rid of their exploiters, there would be wealth aplenty to go around. And the economic models that they admired were socialists. Why did these leaders follow the wrong model? Were they ignorant? On the contrary, many like Michael Manley, the late Prime Minister of Jamaica, they were highly intelligent men, and he was a graduate of a distinguished institution, the London School of Economics. But they admired the early independence heroes, Nehru, Sukarno, Mao Zedong, Tito. None of these early freedom fighters believed that wealth was something that had to be created by entrepreneurs, people who raised capital, organized workers to produce goods and services that others wanted and would pay for because their prices were competitive. They all believed that there were shortcuts to prosperity, and they thought the best way was by state intervention. This was a mistake that otherwise well-intentioned leaders like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania made. He was a good, honest Christian, but held doctrinaire ideas on how to modernize Tanzania. His policies were ill-suited for a small-scale African agricultural economy. And both Julius Nyerere and Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia failed to develop their economies. On the other hand, Jomo Kenyatta and his successor, Daniel Arap Moi of Kenya, made their country more prosperous in spite of considerable corruption. What was the difference? It lay in the intervention in state policies of the first two compared to the free market policies of Kenya. I've been asked time and again, how was it that my colleagues and I avoided falling into this trap? Before I answer this question, let me start by explaining how I became politicized. The first turning point of my life was World War II, the way the British was routed by the Japanese. Before the war broke out, our British rulers feared that the Asians would panic if bombs and shells fell upon them. When the bombs and shells actually came, it was the British bosses who were shocked and packed their families off. Their Chinese, Indian, and Malay subjects stoically bore their sufferings. That aura of overwhelming superiority with which the British held us in thrall was broken, never to be restored. Another turning point was the experience of the brutality and cruelty of our Japanese conquerors. They had portrayed themselves as liberators of fellow Asians from the white man, but they left us in no doubt that they were the new masters of their so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And to punish the Chinese in Singapore for supporting the nationalist government of China with donations to fight Japanese aggression, within the first 15 days of their conquest of Singapore, they picked off at random 50,000 to 100,000 Chinese youths out of concentration centers and machine gunned them on the beaches. I had first-hand experience of Japanese militarism when a Japanese platoon decided to build themselves in my home. My family had fled to the countryside, and it was 4 days of hell. I was roughed up, slapped, made to kneel down by a sentry, kicked in the chest, sent sprawling because I did not know that I had to bow to him to cross the bridge. I felt that the dark ages had descended upon us. And I watched 80,000 dejected British, Indian, and Australian troops march into captivity in 48 hours. Many of my friends shared this harrowing experience. We asked ourselves, why? What right had the Japanese to do this to us? Why did the British not fight the Japanese more ferociously to defend us? And when the British came back after 3.5 years, after the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the communists who had organized the resistance in the jungles of Malaya attempted to grab power as theirs as of right. But I feared them as much as I feared the Japanese. As a result, many nationalists like me were born. After the war, my contemporaries and I gathered in London. We were studying in various universities in England, and there was ferment in the air. India had got its independence in 1947. So had Pakistan, Burma, Ceylon. Why not Malaya, which then included Singapore? The British cut off Singapore from Malaya as they prepared to give independence to the Malays in Malaya. They wanted to keep Singapore as one link in a chain of naval bases from Portsmouth to Gibraltar, to Suez, to Aden, to Singapore, to Sydney. But after the British lost Suez in 1956, they agreed to let us rejoin Malaya. By then, it was too late. The Malay majority was not prepared to treat the Chinese, Indian, and other ethnic groups as equal citizens when they became as numerous as the Malays. What were my motivations? First, to get rid of colonialism and be independent. This got us involved in a fight against the communists who were well ahead of us in the struggle against the British. Later, we rejoined Malaya and had to fight the Malay extremists who wanted to dominate other ethnic groups in Malaysia. As a result, in less than 2 years of federation, Singapore was asked to leave. And we had to agree because the alternative was bloodshed, which the Malaysian Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman warned us. So suddenly, in August 1965, we had to create a nation out of a motley collection of Chinese, Indians, Malays, and others who had come to Singapore to seek a better life, but not to be a nation. How did we escape choosing the wrong model? Well, we were helped by the examples of failed policies in many new countries. India, Pakistan, Ceylon, Burma, and Indonesia had gained their independence in the 1940s. Ghana and Nigeria in the 1950s. By 1965, they were not thriving. India's Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, had imbibed socialist theories from his generation of British philosophers, economists, and political scientists when he was a student at Cambridge. A powerful factor then was the example of the British under Clement Attlee, whose Labour government had set out to equalize opportunities and results. Their policies led to the nationalization of key industries, iron and coal, steel mills, petrochemicals, synthetic fiber plants, all became state enterprises. So did the railways, the buses, and all manner of transportation. For more than 4 decades, India made the same car. In 1950, Morris Oxford, in a state-run factory. They called it the Hindustan. No one checked the bottom line for rates of return on capital. Profit was a dirty word associated with the capitalists. Now let me confess that in my student days up at Cambridge in the 1940s after World War II, I was convinced that Britain's welfare state was the highest form of civilized society. And in my teen years, I was a great admirer of Pandit Nehru. But I could see that he had adopted the wrong model by the 1960s. That he had set India on the path of a planned economy with concentration on heavy industries, and his successors carried on with these policies until Prime Minister Narasimha Rao began to change course late in the mid-1990s. But there was another compelling reason for pragmatic solutions. In 1965, when we became independent, Indonesia under President Sukarno, a great orator, was waging an undeclared war, low intensity, which he called konfrontasi, an Indonesian word for confrontation, against Singapore and Malaysia. And in Malaysia, the Tunku, the Prime Minister, wanted to bypass Singapore as Malaysia's commercial outlet. We could not afford to risk our future on theories. We had a daunting task to create a new economy, not one so dependent on entrepôt trade with our neighbors. And independence brought worries for our future, not euphoria. We were no longer the commercial, administrative, or military center of the British Empire and Southeast Asia. The British were departing. The odds were against our survival, and we had to ensure our own existence, which we had previously taken for granted. Our first preoccupation for survival, which meant economic viability, had to be solved. Next, security. I cast around for solutions. We reached out first to Hong Kong and Taiwan investors in textiles, garments, plastics, and low value-added products. Later, a UNDP expert working in Singapore described to me how Israel had leapfrogged its neighbors who boycotted them, and exported to Europe and America fruits, flowers, many other things. I thought to myself, why not seek links with the developed countries? Get industrial investments from Europe, Japan, and America. They came, but far and few between. Then, fortuitously, China went into convulsion of the Cultural Revolution, and it reached a crescendo in 1967. So computer companies like Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, National Semiconductors, they passed over Taiwan and Hong Kong, and we attracted them to Singapore. We had political stability, industrial peace, plus English as our working language, pull factors. 20 years later, we had become a major manufacturer of electronics, computers, and disk drives. The leapfrog strategy succeeded. I worked out another strategy, the other side of the coin. That was to create or to turn Singapore, a third world island, into a first world oasis in a third world region, so that entrepreneurs and their families from the first world would base themselves in Singapore whilst they explored the region. So we established up-to-date facilities in communications and transportation, airport, container port, state-of-the-art telecoms and security, personal and public security, health standards to approximate first world, and a living environment equal to the first world. Later, we improved our cultural facilities, museums, symphony orchestras, visiting artists. The hardware part was easy. Getting people to change their habits to match first world infrastructure that they now had, that was difficult, slow and painful. We made progress by a series of campaigns involving the whole population. More courtesy, stop spitting, keep public lavatories clean, not a minor item if you want a tourist trade to prosper, and no chewing gum if you don't want your train doors not to close, and no litter, and no pickpockets. One rewarding decision was to green up the island with trees, palms, shrubs, creepers, flowers, to make Singapore different. We had rain all year round, sunshine. All we needed to do was to plant them and trim them. And we involved the whole population in planting and caring for them. And we made progress. And slowly our people are now acting more like a first world civic society, although there's a long way to go. They still have their telephones buzzing in concerts. We had to do a U-turn to carry our people with us, or we would fail. In place of constant strife and agitation, we had to convince workers and their union leaders that unless we had industrial peace and worker cooperation with management to improve productivity, we would be overwhelmed by our unemployment. The history of Singapore after independence was one hard, long slog to make ourselves relevant and useful to the world, to add value to both foreign investments that we sought and those that we ourselves made with our savings. Our next major task was to establish security, which had to be based on social cohesion of our many races, religions, languages, and cultures. All successor governments of colonial regimes have inherited this problem of multi-tribal, multilingual, multi-religious, multicultural solidarity. How to achieve it? Because without a cohesive people at peace with each other, development was not possible. Our solution to the problem of a young nation was a policy of deliberate gradualism in all matters which involved race, language, culture, and religion. We have 77% Chinese, but from different parts of China speaking different and mutually unintelligible dialects. 14% Malay Muslims from different parts of Malaysia and Indonesia. 8% Indians from different parts of India, speaking totally different languages, the rest from Europe and other parts of Asia. We needed a common language. Had we legislated for one, there would have been trouble. Which one? So we encouraged everyone to learn two languages, English and the mother tongue. English is no group's mother tongue, so no one gained any advantage. And we made it our working language. We have not forced or pressure-cooked a national identity. We have refrained from suppressing ethnic cultures, languages, religions, or their sense of separate identity. We aimed for integration, not assimilation. Another critical decision I made within a year of independence was to build a national service armed force. If we did not have the ability to defend ourselves, nobody, not even our own people, would have faith in our future. Foreign and UN intervention would always come too late. So we studied the Swiss, the Swedes, and the Israelis. The Israelis offered help to build a system for a totally national service armed force. We now have a credible defense capability. To produce results, we need a clean government with an effective civil service. And we had to shape the administration to produce that effective instrument of policy. This required strong, fair, and just leaders with a moral strength to command the respect of the people. Unity in the core group of leaders ensured that we sent clear signals to our people and avoided confusion that would have arisen if the team had bickered and split. Leaders must have that sense of being trustees, that they are only temporarily in charge of the destinies of their people, and that their duty is not only to discharge this trust, but also to pass it on to equally trustworthy and competent hands. So luxurious living while our people were left in poverty and backwardness was out. We ensured complete accountability and open separateness between personal assets and public funds. Corruption, which has been a cancer in many societies, had to be eradicated and constantly kept down. A government voted into office needs an efficient, honest administration staffed by officers recruited completely on merit by a politically neutral body. We had an impartial, capable public service commission with a chairman and members who were shrewd at assessing character. Promotions and rewards of scholarships must be made to the best candidates, and they have to share the nation-building philosophy and the development goals of the political leaders. They must also be adequately paid so that temptations would not be too difficult to resist. Once a political system has been corrupted, right from the top, from the very top to the lowest rungs of the bureaucracy, the problem is almost impossible to solve without a revolution. The cleansing and disinfecting has to start from the top and go downwards in a thorough and systematic way. It was a long and laborious process that can be carried out only by a very strong group of leaders with the courage and the moral authority derived from unquestioned integrity. We just managed it and stopped it before it got out of control. Next, we decided that the people should be stakeholders. Soon after separation, I resolved to enable every household to own their own home. If you're going to get a people to take national service seriously, I could not ask other people's sons to fight and die for the properties of the wealthy. So we worked out a personal savings scheme that allowed them to own an apartment painlessly through installments over 20 years. Today, 95% of Singaporean households are homeowners. Their value between 100,000 US to 400,000 US, between a 3-room to a 5-room apartment. Without this home ownership, we would have become like Tokyo, Seoul, or Hong Kong, where the voters in the city are disaffected when they have to pay a large proportion of their salaries in rents. In Singapore, they have voted for the return of the government in 9 successive general elections. They know who will keep the property values of their homes up. Policies must be pragmatic, not dogmatic. I learned early to ignore political correctness and to reject conventional wisdom when it did not accord with reality or my experience. For example, in the 1960s and 70s, it was politically correct to be anti-American and anti-multinationals. The theory expounded by Latin Americans like Raul Prebesch was that multinationals would reduce them to dependencia. We did not accept this. And we assiduously courted the MNCs. They had the capital, the technology, the know-how, and the markets. We decided it was the fastest way of learning on the job, working for them and with them. Now, I believe it will be equally mistaken to follow mindlessly the current politically correct and stridently advocated view that democracy is the precondition for economic development. I know it's a heresy in Harvard, Cambridge. The theory goes that without democracy, Russia could not develop a free market. Russia could not develop a free market with or without democracy. And it was not borne out by the experience of Taiwan, South Korea, or post-open door China. What a country needs for growth and progress is stability and good government, one that is honest and effective and works for the benefit of the people. Good government should never be shackled by theories, however attractive and logically elegant. From the outset, we decided that education was the key to our future. In what language should we teach? This was a sensitive and emotive issue involving the mother tongues and cultures of various races. And I had to resist the pressure to make Chinese the primary language, although 77% of the people were Chinese. Instead, I made English the working language, not the official language, just the working language. Let's be practical. And I allowed parents to choose between schools that taught in English and Chinese, or Malay and Tamil, or in Chinese with English, or Malay in English, and Tamil in English. It was their choice. And in a few years, parents realized that their children's future was best assured when they were competent in English. In other words, English as the first language and the mother tongue as the second language, because even our Chinese banks were switching to English. We expanded schools, built new technical institutes, polytechnics, and universities. This proved decisive for our progress. My final and most important decision was to prepare, or rather to plan and prepare for succession, and not leave it to chance. After 3 successful elections in 10 years, since we first won and took office in 1959, my old guard colleagues and I were troubled by the caliber of the young men that we had been able to induct. They were the best of our political activists, our supporters, professionals, academics with PhDs, but they were not equal to the original team. My original team had been thrown up by the upheavals of the Second World War and were among the best of that generation. Those that didn't have it were knocked out by sheer elimination of events. Now we were not getting the best to volunteer to join us. We had to identify potential leaders. But how? Well, some people are natural alphas. Activists in their school days as school prefects, sport captains, or presidents of college societies. Alphas usually are extroverts with high energy levels. But as these school and college leaders grew older, many did not measure up. The valedictorian in school does not always make it after college. Few of those voted in college as most likely to succeed make it in the real world. As they grow older, they need other qualities to stay as leaders: higher levels of intellectual ability, a steady character, judgment, a decision-making capability that can win the confidence of those around them. 7 times from 1959 to 1990, before each election, I had to select 20 to 30 candidates who were likely to make good as ministers, but first as members of parliament, and then some as ministers. The easiest attribute to determine is intelligence. Performance in examinations, IQ tests, SAT scores, they give a fair indication of analytical ability. Many that we fielded with PhDs failed as ministers. They lacked something. When I learned from American corporate leaders that they used psychometric tests to recruit and promote their executives, I recall the epic flight of the 3 astronauts on Apollo 13. If you remember, their spaceship malfunctioned 3,000 miles out in space. Any false move, and they would never return to Earth. They remained calm, collected throughout the ordeal, and trusting their fate to the men at ground control whose instructions they followed meticulously. I concluded that NASA's psychological tests on the ground had successfully eliminated those who were prone to panic in a crisis. I decided in 1980, therefore, to adopt their practice. And I had psychological and psychometric tests to help us assess the character of candidates, to weed out those who were not likely to succeed. But they couldn't help us. They couldn't tell us who was likely to succeed. The prospect of failure forced us to talent spot. After a high attrition rate at the beginning, we improved our selection methods. We threw candidates into the deep end of the pool to test their political skills. Finally, I was concerned that the government machinery of the 31 years had been customized to suit my work style. So I made a conscious effort in my last 2 years to make room for my successor so that he can reconfigure the arrangements. So when a new guard of men in their 40s and 50s took over in 1990, there was no crashing of gears, and instead, in the 1990s, Singapore has repeatedly been rated by Transparency International in Berlin among the top 7 least corrupt countries in the world. the least corrupt in Asia. And we have not become decadent and corrupt after 41 years in office. The old guard set high standards because they were brought up that way. The new guards have been able to maintain the self-discipline and integrity in the midst of growing affluence. Our judiciary and the rule of law are rated by the World Economic Forum and the Institute of Management and Development in Geneva, and PERC, which is a rating agency in Hong Kong, as the best in Asia. It commands the respect of the people and of our investors. And Singapore is ranked by WEF and IMD as the second most competitive nation in the world after the United States. They say I do not listen to my opponents. I do, when they are serious opponents. We studied all those items where we were rated poorly, and we set out to do better. We practiced lifelong learning before it became a buzzword. What were the basic strengths that made this possible? A basic idealism and an integrity that drives the whole system. But new forces are at work. The present leaders grew up in a Singapore that was stable and growing year by year. People have got accustomed to the comforts of a modern, affluent society and expect life to be better every year. Opinion polls are becoming a regular feature of public life. Leadership has been reduced to the shaping of a policy so that somehow it would be able to carry the majority. And if not the majority, then the plurality, in the hope that it will expand into a majority by the next election. I view this with mixed feelings as a totally different way from what I used to do. In the 1960s, strikes, demonstrations, disorder, and violence threatened our existence. People faced dire choices. Leaders had to lead, make bold decisions, and act swiftly. Only later did I have to convince the people to support our decisions. For example, I had to carry out a campaign to win a referendum to take Singapore into Malaysia. But when bloodshed threatened and the Malaysian government wanted Singapore to be out, I did not. Indeed, I could not hold a referendum and consult the people before I took them out. That would have meant disaster. I took the decision, persuaded my cabinet colleagues to sign the separation agreement with me, and embarked on independent Singapore. To build a more stable Singapore, I did not discuss nor ask our different races whether they liked to live integrated together in new high-rises when we were building to replace the squatter huts. I knew what the answer was going to be. They wanted to stay together. But would that be good for us? The British had allowed them to be segregated in Malay villages, Chinese quarters, and an Indian enclave because it was easier to rule such groups of people separated by race, language, and religion. We had to form a nation, or try to. So my colleagues and I decided that the people would ballot for their apartments. And they would have Chinese, Malays, Indians, Eurasians, and others as their neighbors. We did not seek their consent. For the first few years, they were not comfortable. After 10 years, it became a way of life. We did the same in the schools. Children used to be segregated into Malay, Chinese, Indian, and English language schools. Slowly and gradually, I persuaded parents to register their children for schools that use English and the mother tongue as a second language. And when they did so, their children graduated into the best jobs. Now we have schools with all races in mixed classrooms, and integration has become a fact of life. The business of government can be executed effectively only by people's representatives, exercising their judgments based on their mandate. The people had given me a mandate to join Malaysia on fair terms. When the Prime Minister of Malaysia was fearful of a bloodbath, I exercised my judgment to separate without consulting the people. So also racial integration and housing and schooling was part of my mandate given in elections every 5 years that I won. The difference between the old guard and the new guard leaders are stark, reflecting the differences between the old society and the new. The old society was a revolutionary situation. People felt that everything, including their lives, were at stake. They trusted their leaders and gave us unstinting support. It was an inspired generation that fought against great odds to succeed as an independent country. The new society is secure, comfortable, confident. Many of the young believe that prosperity and stability to be theirs as of right, and to consult them, and that they must be consulted before any change is made which could affect them. Well, this change is unavoidable, but does it mean that leaders have to govern by the polls, as in many developed societies? However, recent upheavals in Indonesia have brutally reminded Singaporeans of the volatility of their surroundings and alerted them to the dangers that lurk around them. This may stop Singaporeans from becoming too complacent and consumer-driven a society, and remind them that they need to make that extra effort to achieve more than the ordinary. Many failures in the Third World were the result of the leaders of the immediate post-independence period, the 1960s to the 80s, abiding by the theory then prevailing that socialism and state enterprises would hasten development. Their interventionist economic policies led to a misallocation of resources and increased opportunities for corruption. That theory was demolished as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. There is no reason why Third World leaders cannot succeed in achieving growth and development if they can maintain social order, educate their people, maintain peace with their neighbors, and gain the confidence of investors by upholding the rule of law. Finally, are great leaders born, or are they the result of revolutionary situations? From my experience, I think it's both, but more because of circumstances. Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping were thrown out of a massive convulsion of 400 to 500 million Chinese after 100 years of decay and decline into warlordism and Japanese occupation. Mao was the revolutionary who liberated China. Deng was the builder who saved China from imploding like the Soviet Union. Who was the greater leader, Mao or Deng? As leader of the Chinese Communist Party in its fight to liberate China, Mao was unquestionably the unbeatable leader, a genius at guerrilla warfare who defeated the Japanese, or helped to defeat the Japanese and the nationalist government. But was he the modernizer of China? Had he lived on, or had Hua Guofeng, his immediate successor, stayed in charge, China would have gone like the Soviet Union. The party heavyweights brought back Deng, a veteran of the Long March, and Deng was not an ideologue like Mao. Ever the realist with a keen sense of the basics of the economy, he realized that the communist system was not delivering. He opened up China economically in 1979 or late 78 kept a tight hold on political and social control of the country. Although the opening up faltered after Tiananmen in 1989, he pushed it again in 1992 while on a southern tour of Guangdong province. Had Deng followed Gorbachev in implementing both glasnost and perestroika at the same time, China would have collapsed in chaos. Are there no great leaders of that caliber in China today? Surely there must be. But present-day China requires a different kind of leader. Not creators of liberation armies, but competent, imaginative, builders of the economy and flexible managers of the huge social and political changes that will flow from the opening up of China to the world. The needs of a country vary from time to time. China now has the prospect of becoming an advanced technological society in the next 50 years, provided its leaders can manage the changes to its economy and its society. More important, they have to be courageous and skillful enough to adjust and change their political system to involve the better educated, more articulate, and assertive people, 70% of whom will live in the cities, and they will have to do all this without losing political stability. Similarly, the difference in mood between America and Europe, both under threat in World War II and their comfortable consumer societies of the 1990s. This explains the absence of towering leaders. Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, Charles de Gaulle, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, Secretary of State Dean Acheson. They were strong leaders that people needed in times of crisis. Neville Chamberlain gave way to Churchill, who promised the British people blood, sweat, and tears. After Nazi Germany was defeated and the danger had passed, they voted in Clement Attlee as Prime Minister, Churchill's small, mild-looking deputy during the war. Similarly, de Gaulle became the symbol of French resistance to a German-occupied Vichy France under Marshal Pétain. He returned in triumph to Paris in 1944, but went into retirement after he made two partially successful attempts or unsuccessful attempts to reorganize the government. He was recalled from retirement and elected president in 1958 by the National Assembly during a severe crisis over the stalemate of the Algerian War. When France was restored to prosperity, the young wanted change and took to the streets. De Gaulle resigned when he lost the referendum in 1969. Security, prosperity, and the consumer society plus mass communications have made for a different kind of person getting elected as leader. One who can present himself and his program in a polished way. Satellite television has allowed me to follow the American presidential campaign. I'm amazed at the way media professionals can give a candidate a new image and transform him, at least superficially, into a different personality. Winning an election becomes, in large measure, a contest in packaging and advertising. These new techniques have been so successful that Europe has also bought into them. A spin doctor now is a high-income professional, one in great demand. From such a process, I doubt if a Churchill, a Roosevelt, or a de Gaulle can emerge. The difference between Winston Churchill and Tony Blair is the difference between their two societies. One caught in a titanic struggle, the other comfortable and secure, facing no external threats, reluctant to join Europe, or reluctant to join the euro, or to have his accustomed way of life upset in a federal Europe. Revolutionary situations throw up great leaders who demand blood, sweat, and tears. Comfortable circumstances produce leaders who promise people an even easier life, whether they can deliver it or not. But when the British felt that Britain was slipping, they voted for a conviction politician in Margaret Thatcher 3 times, from 1979 to 1990. Similarly, when the Americans feared that their country was becoming weak during the Carter years, when American diplomats were held as hostages in Tehran and the Soviet Union menacingly invaded Afghanistan, they voted for Ronald Reagan for 2 terms. Germany, defeated and divided after the war, produced Konrad Adenauer. Germany recovered and became the economic engine of Europe. Germans still felt threatened and vulnerable. They voted 4 times for another conviction politician, Helmut Kohl, who for 16 years cooperated closely with America and established strong bonds with France. When the opportunity came with the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, he seized the moment, and by 1990 had reunified Germany. With Germany reunited and the danger from Russia diminished, the people's mood changed. In 1998, they voted Kohl out in favor of Gerhard Schröder. Germans wanted a change to a new media-savvy generation of Bill Clintons and Tony Blair. This brings me to my last question. Can you teach a person to be a leader? Yes, if that person has the primary attributes to be a leader. Then lessons in leadership will help him develop his skills and become more effective, a leader with fewer costly errors. Arnold Toynbee, in his massive study of history, argues that if the challenge is too great for a people, they will fail, however great the leader. But that if there is no challenge, a people will not achieve much. Fortunately for Singapore, the challenge was not beyond the capability of its leaders to draw the best out of the people. If Singapore has once again to face circumstances as daunting as those in the first decade of its existence, both people and leaders must be able to rise to the occasion for the country to survive. Thank you.
Good evening, Senior Minister Lee. My name is Felicity Spector, and I work at the Centre for Public Leadership here at the Kennedy School. I'm also a television journalist from Britain, and it's in that aspect, if you like, that I ask my question. When you were an opposition member of the Malay Parliament in 1964, you passionately defended the idea of a free press, and you said, if your ideas and your views cannot stand the challenge of criticism, then they are too fragile and not sturdy enough to last. Why then, as the leader of Singapore, did you react to restrict the freedom of the press and of opponents within Parliament? And do you think this has stopped Singapore from becoming a first world civic society in the fullest sense of the meaning?
Circumstances change and create new situations, and the individual must react to it. Rhetoric is part of the business of leadership. It is. But even as I said it in Malaysia, I knew that certain things were out of bounds. In Singapore, when we had just separated and the Malays were unhappy, felt betrayed and abandoned, for issues of race, language, and religion to be raised in public would have been very dangerous. Therefore, I think there's something wrong with it.
You got the mic? His mic is gone. Here, use mine.
It should be on? Okay, fine. I do not believe that we had suppressed or stifled the opposition. An open debate is necessary for any democracy, but there are certain areas which at various times in the people's history are too sensitive for open discussion. Let me explain. If in the 1960s I had raised the question of whether Chinese should or should not be the national language, I might have ended up in a riot. So I quietly called up the Chinese Chamber of Commerce and told them that if they wanted peace and quiet, they should not be pressing for Chinese as the national language, because that will immediately stir up such a hornet's nest, fear in the Malays and the Indians who wouldn't be able to master the language, and we'd be at each other's throats. Now, in the more relaxed circumstances of the 1990s or the year 2000, anybody can say what they like about language because the issue is quite clear. Parents have decided that that is the way to the future. But even today, if you have a free-for-all for religion, we're going to end up in a real mess. I brought a case against the Far Eastern Economic Review in 1989, where they had accused me of attacking the Catholic Church, which was completely unfounded. So a very aggressive British QC gave me 2 days in the witness box to say, what's wrong? I said to him that he could defend Salman Rushdie's book in England, but that we had already decided to ban it before it became an issue. Was it wise? I think it was. What was the point of having this unnecessary rumpus? Freedom of intellectual discussion, when it was a matter that aroused enormous passion. The Muslims in Singapore were not interested in what was in Salman Rushdie's book. They were interested in the fatwa or the edict of the Iranian Ayatollah, and that anybody who killed Salman Rushdie would get a reward and go to heaven. So in that situation, you begin to argue. If you look at what's happening in the Middle East, I think much of the trouble really is that some things are not possible of civil discourse. It arouses too much passion and emotion. But as we become more affluent and comfortable and our Malays are more relaxed, perhaps we can do this. But then we have neighbors who are quite easily agitated by what we are saying in Singapore. So we have to be careful. We are not Britain with the French to worry about or the Germans. We have a different backdrop, and we have to have a keen sense of survival.
听完李光耀在25年前的这场演讲，我们再回头看看今天的世界，不得不感叹，历史确实充满了巨大的讽刺。他当年所推崇的那些关于领导力的标准，像一面镜子，清晰地照出了当今东西方治理模式的巨大差异。他为我们总结了几个核心要点：第一，危机造就领袖，安逸产生政客。他认为，丘吉尔、罗斯福那样的伟大领袖，只能诞生于国家存亡的危机时刻，而安逸的环境只会产生精于包装和表演的政客。第二，领导者必须务实而非教条。 他公开挑战民主是发展的前提等西方政治正确，强调稳定和好政府才是一切的根基。第三，国家必须为未来深谋远虑。他将继任者计划视为自己最重要的决定，因为他深知一个国家的长治久安，远比一代人的成败更重要。25年过去了，一边是新加坡、中国这样依然在强调长期规划、精英治理和实事求是的国家，在各自的道路上取得了巨大的发展。而另一边，我们看到的是西方世界，尤其是美英等国，似乎陷入了一种恶性循环，领导人不再是解决问题的信念型政治家，而更像是精于包装和表演的网红或小丑。他们痴迷于民意调查和选举游戏，却对国家面临的长期挑战束手无策。值得一提的是，当年那位英国记者对新加坡新闻自由的傲慢提问，在今天看来更像一个巨大的反讽。一个习惯于对别国指手画脚、鼓吹所谓自由的帝国，如今自己在国内却连许多敏感议题都无法触碰，这本身就是个笑话。这确实引人深思。当一种政治体制选出的领导人越来越无法应对真正的挑战时，这究竟是领导人个人的问题，还是体制本身已经出现了根本性的问题？中国的治理模式被西方称为独裁，新加坡的模式被批评为威权，但他们都取得了成功。而自诩民主自由的西方却选出了一代又一代令人失望的领导人，这到底是为什么？以及我们又该如何理解一个曾经在特定历史时期诞生过强有力领导者的政治体系，如今却似乎再也培养不出能够带领他们走出困境的人物了？如果你认为这期节目对你有价值，请点赞、评论、分享、订阅我们的频道。感谢你的观看。